The year is 1842. A group of German Jewish immigrants in Cincinnati have just started a new congregation, KK B'nai Yeshurun. This small congregation consists of 50 people. This group of Jews have no way of knowing it, but they just laid the foundation for Wise Temple. This small group of Jews were all German immigrants. They were originally part of KK B'nai Israel, now Rockdale Temple. However, the way this congregation was run didn't blend with the traditions of German Jews. After a few years, the German Jews broke off and formed their own congregation, KK B'nai Yeshurun. A few years later, in 1846, the congregation elected their first rabbi, James K. Guffman. Guffman was one of the most important men in the history of Wise Temple. He was the first man to introduce the congregation to reforms, such as implementing a choir during services. This switch to reform ways would end up becoming Wise Temple's most important feature. After that, the Lodge Street Synagogue was dedicated on September 22, 1848, with the dues being $6 annually. This was a huge step for what would become Wise Temple. Now with an official synagogue, the congregation could continue to grow even faster. Then, in 1853, KK B'nai Yeshurun took its biggest step yet, permanently changing not only the congregation's history, but the history of Reform Judaism as we know it, as they engaged Rabbi Isaac M. Wise.
And when they brought in Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise in 1852 to be the rabbi here, he was big thinking. He believed that America would be the next golden age of Jewish life. Not Germany, which he was from Germany, and everybody there believed and acted and behaved as if it was going to be the next great golden age of Jewish life, and they would have been right until Hitler would then come along a half century later.
Change was not easy at this point in the congregation's history. Before Rabbi Wise arrived, there had been conflicts between the more liberal German Jews and the more conservative members. With two Orthodox rabbis preceding him, Rabbi Wise had to step up if he wanted to make any significant changes. Rabbi Wise came to the congregation with the condition that he would be named rabbi for life. With his prior experience with the congregation Beth El in Albany, New York, he was ready for what B'nai Yisrael was going to throw at him. Rabbi Wise brought with him a very liberal philosophy of Judaism. He wanted to merge American Judaism with the optimism of the early 19th century. The congregation heard Rabbi Wise's plan for reform and fully embraced it.
As an American city, this was the Queen City, and it was growing very quickly when Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise came to the congregations and was really starting to help it grow in the 50s and 60s of the 1800s. I also think that it's a ripe city, and I actually feel about it then how I feel about it now, which is it's not the most major metropolitan area. It's not New York, it's not Atlanta, and yet it's also a phenomenal place. It's more affordable. It's interesting because it has all this American history and Jewish history, and yet it's also forward-looking. And I think that's what Isaac Mayer Wise met in the moments that he really came to the congregation, and his vision met the confluence of history.
Rabbi Wise quickly got to work reforming B'nai Yeshurun. In 1954, Rabbi Wise began publication of the Israelite, a Jewish newspaper that publishes weekly in Cincinnati, Ohio, and is currently the second longest running Jewish newspaper behind only the London Chronicle. He also introduced a choir, which he initially conducted himself with his violin. Wise Temple still uses a choir to this day. By 1858, only 5 years after Rabbi Wise was introduced, the congregation had 220 members and was reported to be the second largest congregation in the United States. But the congregation didn't stop growing there. By May 12, 1865, the laying of Plum Street Temple's cornerstone took place. Plum Street Temple would soon become one of the most recognizable and important temples to ever exist.
Plum Street Temple being here at this very special corner, which Isaac Mayer Wise did on purpose, right, across from the Catholic Church, originally across from a Protestant church, still diagonal from City Hall. The Jews had arrived here, and the city felt good about that too, as I understand it.
A little over a year later, on Friday, August 24, 1866, Plum Street Temple was dedicated. As a daily paper at the time put it, Cincinnati has never before seen such grandeur pressed into such a small space. The temple was originally budgeted to cost $35,000 for the land and $55,000 for the building, but the total cost ended up exceeding way past that for a total cost of $260,000, although this was mainly due to post-Civil War inflation. Plum Street Temple is still one of the most fantastic buildings I've ever had the pleasure of seeing. Its beauty truly can't be described, you just have to come see it yourself. 7 years later, in 1873, Rabbi Wise founded the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now called the Union for Reform Judaism, which became the umbrella body for the Reform movement in North America. This was a way that Reform communities around America could coordinate ideas and events with one another. Then, only 1 year later, Rabbi Wise founded Hebrew Union College, which is one of the oldest rabbinical schools. Unfortunately, Hebrew Union College's Midwest campus is closing down.
Cincinnati. So in a few years, then we won't have rabbinical students here, but we still have the campus. We'll still have the library. Which is the Clow Library at HUC, but most people don't know this, is the second largest Jewish library in the world. If you want to find a bigger Jewish library, you have to go to Jerusalem. The American Jewish Archives is the biggest repository of American Jewish history. That will still be here. And there'll be other programs. They'll bring people in for shorter term programs, and people will still come to Hebrew Union College. So HUC will be open. It just won't have the same kind of structure here in Cincinnati that it has for 147 years.
I think that it already has started to affect it, and it will affect the synagogue more in two ways. One is we've relied on interns, tutors, B'nai Mitzvah tutors in particular, religious school teachers. They have been such a huge part of our lives, those coming from Hebrew Union College. And so certainly we could hire an intern, but it wouldn't be someone to come after school 3 days a week. It would have to be someone who'd come, one weekend a month. It would be a very different relationship, and I think that will impact our congregation. We've prided ourselves on being what Rabbi Kamras calls a teaching hospital. The second piece of it is I don't know that the impact will be felt immediately, but eventually, maybe in 10 or 15, maybe 20 years, what we will not have that we currently have is a cadre of professors from Hebrew Union College who live in the community, both retired and current professors, and I think that's positively impacted our synagogue and the wider community.
A few years after that, in 1889, Rabbi Wise founded the Central Conference for Reform Rabbis, which was the professional union for Reform rabbis in America. Rabbi Isaac M. Wise had done so much for Reform Judaism and KK B'nai Yeshurun, and what he has done will never be forgotten. But he unfortunately passed away on March 26, 1900, at the age of 80. His pulpit chair at Plum Street was draped in black and kept vacant for a year in his honor. After that, the congregation got content with where it was. It would take until 1931, a little over 3 decades later, for KK B'nai Yeshurun's next big step. In 1931, B'nai Yeshurun merged with Reading Road Temple, making the combined membership of 908 families. Rabbi Samuel Wohl of Reading Temple became the Rabbi B'nai Yeshurun, along with B'nai Yeshurun's own Rabbi James Heller. Both rabbis were Zionists, which at the time was a trait not many Reform rabbis shared. Together, under their leadership, B'nai Yeshurun and Reading Road Temple became known as Isaac M. Wise Temple.
There was a period of time, actually, when we had 2 senior rabbis, co-senior rabbis. So, not in my period and not before me. And that's when Rabbi Wohl, who came as a young rabbi from the Reading Road Temple, which was a smaller congregation, and we had Rabbi Heller, and Rabbi Heller was this powerful, magnetic figure, this scholar and charismatic figure, and Rabbi Wohl was quieter and more pastoral and more comforting. Heller was known all around the city. He was a musician. He actually wrote the notes about songs and classical music for the symphony, kind of a Renaissance guy. These were 2 totally different personalities. Then later, Wohl was here and he brought in Rabbi Al Goldman. And Rabbi Goldman really was this kind of social justice figure who marched in Selma. Congregation wasn't so happy with him at that point, because he was anti-war during Vietnam. Again, not the kind of thing everybody was always happy with. And a very different personality than Rabbi Wohl when Rabbi Wohl was around for some of that time. So you had these 2 very different rabbis even operating at the same time.
Isaac M. Wise Temple, also just known as Wise Temple, continued being a forward-thinking congregation. In 1971, Wise Temple had a rabbinical student named Sally Prieston to intern. Although she didn't stay due to not being promised the role of senior rabbi, she would later become the first woman ever to be ordained as a rabbi, just 1 year later. 4 years later, in 1975, Plum Street Temple was placed under the National Register of Historic Places. Then 8 years later, in 1983, an organization by the name of Friends of Plum Street Temple was inaugurated on March 25th with the devotion of maintaining the historic monument. And maintain it they did, because just 12 years later, in 1995, they underwent a huge renovation which included extensive structural, electrical, and interior work, allowing the temple to be used for many more years.
Counted the light bulbs at Plum Street Temple. We have a lot of light bulbs at Plum Street Temple. When it was built, there wasn't even electricity. It's a 150-year-old building. Electricity was added in 1903. We just about 3 years ago put in LED bulbs everywhere for environmental reasons. That wouldn't seem like such a big deal, but you have to put up scaffolding, which is actually thousands of dollars to do to reach the very high bulbs at the top of the 6.5-story tall sanctuary. People never knew how many bulbs, but after that project, I know exactly how many bulbs because we put them all in. The answer is 999.
Before that, in 1985, the current senior rabbi, Louis H. Cameras, was engaged as an assistant rabbi. Rabbi Cameras would go on to have a very successful career here at Wise Temple.
So I came to the congregation as the assistant rabbi 37 years ago, thinking I'd be here for 3, 4, 5 years before going to my own place. Turns out that after 3.5 years, the senior rabbi went to his home community where he was from, and I remained here. I raised my children here. Now my grandchildren who are young are being raised here. So in many ways, this has not only been a job, this has been my community where I found my friends and a sense of community and a sense of belonging and being connected to something. So it's been very rich in that way because it's been not just a job, but it's been kind of wrapped around to everything in my life.
In 2005, a restoration of the historic Kogan, Oregon was done by the NOAC Oregon Company. The Oregon, now renamed the Rockwood Oregon in honor of the Rockwood Charitable Foundation, was the original Oregon installed in the temple way back in 1866, showing the congregation's strong belief in heritage. In 2010, Rabbi Cameras would celebrate his 25th year at Isaac M. Wise Temple and would receive an honorary doctoral degree from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. In 2013, a historic event in Reformed Jewish life took place when the congregation ordained 3 different rabbis, each from a different Hebrew Union College campus. Rabbi Karen Thomasaw as an assistant rabbi, Rabbi Sidney Herring and Rabbi Rachel Miriam as assistant rabbis.
My experience as a rabbi with the congregation, I think it's been an excellent experience for a couple of reasons. One, I think Cincinnati is a really unique Jewish community. The community at large is also outstanding. It's one of the, I think, 24th largest city in the country, and there are so many arts venues. It's one of only 10 cities in the world, I understand, to have more than 10 venues that are really high level, like football and baseball and the opera and dancing and a symphony and an art museum, etc. And so of course, Jewishly, it's the birthplace of Reform Judaism in the United States. So I think it's an amazing city, and it's really neat to be a rabbi at this historic congregation.
In 2016 through 2017, the 150th anniversary of Plum Street and the 175th anniversary of the congregation were observed. In honor of this, the congregation commissioned 2 new Torah Scrolls to be created. They were scribed by the congregants and Neil Yerman. This was an amazing event that I had the pleasure of participating in.
About 5 years ago, when we were celebrating a 175th anniversary of the congregation and 150th anniversary of Plum Street Temple, and we undertook the writing of 2 Torah Scrolls. And we asked people to come, families to come, and to actually put a letter, to take their hand with the sofer, the scribe, because the Torah is handwritten, and put 1 letter into the Torah. Torah being the most essential piece of scriptures in Judaism, being Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. What you see behind me are 5 Torah scrolls, and one of those 2 scrolls that we commissioned, brand new, in which everybody put a letter in, is sitting right there, and we use that now every week when we read Torah during services. So it was a very powerful experience to see people come and families come and feel like they were very much connecting to something ancient and yet in their lives and part of their community. Very powerful experience.
Wise Temple has had a fantastic history and it continues to evolve every day, like with their new service streaming every Friday night. I'm honored to be considered a part of this congregation. There is truly nothing greater. Wise continues to grow and influence congregations all over the world, and I can't wait to see what big thing they do next.